Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this podcast with John Anderson. It was an incredible honour to interview him and spend some time with him. A great Australian, a great leader. He talks about his faith deeply, tells an incredibly personal story from his childhood and what actually brought him to faith, a really sad tragedy with his sister's death. He talks about politics when he was in politics and John Howard, and a lot about culture, Australia, its Christian heritage, and we talk a bit about the voice referendum. We kind of cover everything, so hope you enjoy the podcast. Great. Well, welcome to the Leadership Lessons podcast. Our guest today is John Anderson, and John is a sixth generation farmer and grazier who spent 19 years in the Australian Parliament, most notably as the leader of the National Party and Deputy Prime Minister along with John Howard. So post-politics, John has continued to be a strong voice in the Australian culture, and John's podcast called Conversations has had millions of views on YouTube and downloads on podcasts. He talks with world-class thought leaders such as Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Haidt, Peter Hitchens, Tom Holland, Warren Farrell. I've also noticed you had Unomi Park on there, John. So some amazing guests you've had, and it's great to have you with me tonight, John, filming this podcast. So welcome.
Good to be with you.
Fantastic. I listed a few of the guests you've had on your Conversations podcast, John, that were actually probably some of my favourites. So have you had any favourites yourself that you've interviewed over the years?
I enormously appreciate all the people who have given me time, and so I'm reluctant to say that any of them stand out. For me, the very first one that I launched with Jordan Peterson, we had several in the can, but then he was in Sydney, and I didn't know much about him at the time, just on 5 years ago. So we had a conversation, and it was sparkling and fun, and we got on really well. He taught me an incredible amount. For example, at the end of it, he said to me, I said, it's a bit long, so we'll cut it down to something manageable. He said, no, don't cut it down. It's absolutely perfect. Young people like listening to content. That was great content. He said it, not me. And of course, it took off. It put us on the map. And so now 5 years later, as you say, I think we're on 54 million YouTube views, downloads, and some 300,000 subscribers. A lot of them American, I have to say.
Oh, really?
Because, well, the nature of the people we talk to. I have a couple of other particular favourites. The last one I did with Oz Guinness, I think it's only had 13,000 YouTube downloads, which is not a large number, but he and I both were really happy with it, and I'm very fond of Oz. And he talks of the civilizational moment that we're in now, and I think the wisdom he shares in that one is a really good one.
Yeah.
The one that's up at the moment, as I speak, is Them Before Us. The need for children to have access wherever possible to the right family environment. The book's title, it's about the book by Katie Faust and Abigail and Stacey Manning. That's another one that I think's important. Anyway, so fantastic. I've enjoyed them all.
Oh, they're brilliant guests. I'm actually a bit of a fan of Tom Holland as well, even though he might maybe a little bit of a different category to some of your other guests, but I've read a lot of his books and find him fascinating. So we actually had to listen to your podcast in a recent training course I was doing. We had to listen to your podcast with Tom Holland, just looking at the origins of the West and Christianity and how it's really shaped how Australians think. So it was in a course I was doing about how to really contextualize the gospel and share the gospel in a way that makes sense to your average Australian. So we used your Tom Holland interview as a little bit of training material there. So, and what are you really trying to do with the conversations, with the podcast? Like what do you feel like your mission there? Like what are you trying to achieve?
I believe we are at a civilizational moment. We're running out of the fuel that's kept us free and prosperous for so long. We're looking for alternative fuels. The engine's not running on them very well. And all civilizations have faced this. There have been many civilizations that are no longer around. They've run out of fuel. They haven't found a substitute. They haven't refueled, so they've just died. I think we're in serious times. And I think there are many good thinkers, not all right of centre, I have to say, who have valuable things to say, valuable perspectives to put. ideas that are, really important for us to think through that are not being presented in our educational institutions, don't seem to be understood by the media, certainly not advanced by the media, which are really important if we are to be politically, culturally, and economically literate. So we're trying to provide a conduit for world-class thinking where I try not to interrupt, just to sort of guide the conversation in a way that lets people sort of give of their best and put their thoughts out there. It's really interesting that if I do try and interrupt, I'll get a lot of comments back saying, John, this is not your normal model. We want you to let these people speak and we'll make up our minds on what we think. And I think, well, terrific. That's great. I'll take the point. And so I try to avoid entrapment. I'm not into entrapment at all.
Yes.
The way most people online and the mainstream media are. And I try really hard just to facilitate the providing of a conduit to people. And what really warms my heart is the constant trickle of younger people who contact us saying, hey, this is great. I can't get access to this alternative set of views, even though most of them are frankly absolutely mainstream. They wouldn't have been remarkable at all 15 years ago. I can't get it at school, university, in the workplace. I had one young bloke the other day, terrific young Australian. He was in his late 20s, a very gifted engineer working with a very big company. And he just said to me, I'm an engineer. And someone said the other day at work something about emissions reductions, which was technically wrong. And I knew it was technically wrong. I said, did you say so? And he said, no, I hesitated. I realised it could damage my career, even though I knew absolutely that it was going to lead to a mistake. So I said, what did you do? He said, well, I pointed it out as politely as I could. And I said, were there any repercussions? He said, no, not yet, thank goodness. But I thought, what are we coming to?
Yeah,
I mean, really, if you were building a Spitfire in the build up to the Second World War and somebody said, well, if we make these adjustments to the carburetor, it'll go better. And another engineer says, well, actually, I'm sorry, I can tell you now that'll cause the Spitfire to crash. Would we have seen that as a good thing to shut somebody down on? We've gone nuts shutting people down now if it's not something we want to hear.
Yeah. So what is it that the young people really are appreciating about what you're doing? Like, could you put it down to something specific? Is it just the common sense?
Absolutely. Well, that's part of it. But there's a lot of young people out there who know that the sort of victimhood culture that we've built is bad news. Because you're either a victim or you're a victim maker. In reality, of course, we're all a mixture of good and bad. But the modern way, the modern identity politics and grievance industry creates a whole lot of victims. And if you're a victim, then they weaponize you and try and keep you as a victim. And if you're not a victim anymore, of course, they lose their power. And if you're not a victim, you're a victim maker. So there's no other way of putting this. A lot of the best and most thoughtful of our young white men, if I can put it that way, traditional Australian men, they feel they're the ones who are being described as toxic in their masculinity. They are the victim makers. They are the sons of and grandsons of terrible, imperialistic, colonialistic, racist oppressors, and they're saying, "Hey, I mean, this is." I know I've got my failings, but I don't think I'm a victim. I'm not setting out to make victims. I don't want to be a terrible person. And they are looking for a better narrative. And I'll tell you something else that Jordan Peterson showed me. I've seen it in action. A lot of our young people are not getting encouragement. They're supposed to be in the age of telling everybody they're wonderful and they're doing well and building up their self-esteem. It's not working. Because particularly those young men who think that they're being painted as the problem in society today because of their masculinity, just because they're male. It's amazing how a bit of encouragement, a bit of reassurance, a bit of, go back to your bedroom, sort yourself out, go out and be as noble as you can, it really does actually affect them positively.
What is phenomenal, the Jordan Peterson effect, and that's a lot of his tone and narrative has been along those lines of encouraging young people, especially men, which I think is fantastic. You talk a lot in your Conversations podcast about the Christian worldview or Christianity as a foundation to Australian culture. It seems like that's something that you really enjoy talking about and that you try to bring through, and that's something that you believe. Where do you think we're at in Australia when it comes to our Christian foundations and heritage? Do you think that's completely lost, or do you think it's salvageable?
It's very, very, very eroded, extraordinarily corroded. Our foundational values are, if you like, widely distrusted and disbelieved today. And I saw some fascinating research out of the United States the other day that indicates that over the last 25 years, in crude terms, the number of Americans who think patriotism, belief in America, is important to them has halved. The number of Americans who think that religion is important to them has halved, in general terms. The number of Americans who say children are very important to me has gone in 25 years from over 60% to 30%, less than a third.
Yeah, wow.
And the number of people who think money's important has gone up dramatically. So we are eating out the foundations of our culture. That Christianity is the foundation stone of our culture. I mean, no, very, very few serious thinkers would argue with that, whether they personally believe or not. And in some ways, the Bible is not a political book, of course. It's and Christ is not a political figure. His followers wanted him to be a political figure. They wanted him to rise up and set them free from Rome, and he wasn't a political figure. He was a spiritual figure. But the Bible paints a view of mankind or humanity, to use my words a little more carefully, that has profoundly influenced the formation of democracy. And it's the idea that at one hand, every individual has worth and dignity made in the image of God. On the other hand, every individual is capable of pride, of failings, of selfishness, of greed. Therefore, we need to find a way to respect the right of every individual to live freely, to choose who will lead them peacefully, to remove them peacefully, and what have you. As one American put it, we're so good we had to give ourselves the vote. We're so bad we had to give ourselves the vote, if you get the principle behind it. Now, we're washing that out of the system. That model developed a garden. Cultures where, frankly, we were not only prosperous and what have you, but we learned to maybe prosperous in many ways because we learnt to live with our deepest differences. That was one of the things democracies let us do. But the garden is now becoming overgrown with weeds, and the jungle is encroaching again as we abandon our commitment to the garden. We're becoming a cut flower society. We've taken the best out of the garden and we've put it in a vase and removed it from its life sources, the soil, the nutrients, the water. And every time there's a hot wind, the flowers wilt a bit more and they take a bit longer to recover. This worries me.
Yes.
Is it too late? No, of course not. Of course not. But we desperately need leaders now who will stand up and challenge the narrative. See, this is the point. Okay, so we've deserted our Christian faith. We've gone looking for a new fuel to run our society on. We call it all sorts of things like identity politics, which is really tribalism. We've abandoned the idea of loving our neighbour. We've even abandoned the idea of tolerance. We're now into conflict. It's not working very well.
No.
And it's working particularly badly for our young people who are our future.
Yes.
They're unheard of levels of depression, of anxiety. These are the statistics. I was saying the other day in a meeting, I made the comment we need to be worried about our young people. And a couple of ladies came up to me, what's wrong with our young people? They're doing very well. And I said, well, I hope your children are. And that's terrific in their circle of friends. But the raw numbers tell you that educationally the standards are collapsing. We have amongst the worst classroom behaviour in the world.
Wow.
We are falling behind in a whole range of expertise areas that we need. Our young people are leaving school economically largely illiterate. Not all of them, but many of them are, and ill-equipped to cope with the challenges confronting with us. They haven't been given the opportunity to build resilience, or what Jonathan Haidt calls anti-fragility, the old message that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. We try and snowplow all the problems out of the way for them. And it's an indication of the fact that, quite frankly, the fuel we're trying to run our culture on now is not a very good one.
Yeah. What would you see as a way forward for Australia? Do you think for Australia we just get sucked into what's happened in Europe, the Americanization of the West, or do you think there's a way for us uniquely in Australia that we could maybe come through this, return to our roots, or what are your thoughts?
It's a very good question. I don't really know. In an age of media, a very thoughtful man once said to me, the idea of the victim culture spread internationally incredibly quickly. So if you take the first Superman 1, he's all hero. And there's never any time for inward-looking, woe is me stuff. Superman 2, well, man, he's got issues. And that movie spreads over the world. So that's already a few years out of date now. But I think the point is that cultural ideas spread very, very rapidly. Is there pushback? Yes. And some of it's clumsy. America's divided down the middle. Whatever people say about President Trump, it's really important to recognize something. He was the product of the problem, as much as some people might say he was the problem. No, he was the product of an America that was divided, where too many Americans said, our way of life is slipping away. We've got, if you like, the culture's got cancer. We're going to go for some radical chemotherapy to try and cauterize it and turn it around. And I'm not saying it wasn't very clumsy or even that it's worked, but I'm saying recognize there's a lot of people who are saying we are going the wrong way. Well, what we've got to do, I hope, in our own very modest way, what you and I are doing right now is talking about this, getting people to think about it. We need to reinvigorate our confidence in ourselves. We need to shake off our complacency. We need to get engaged again. This is the age of disengagement. We know that. It's quite extraordinary. People will not engage. They won't volunteer to sign up for things, to be committed. You see it with churches. You see it with service clubs. You see it with a whole range of things. You certainly see it in politics. Not enough of the right sort of people coming forward, belonging to a branch, having their say. I said to one fellow who wanted to get involved in politics, go and join the party of your choice, go to a few branch meetings and then ring me up and say, what am I doing here? A few months later, he rang me and said, I've been to a few branch meetings and, pretty ordinary and nobody seemed to get listened to and everybody seemed to disagree and what have you. Is this really what you think I should do? And I said, well, you've just seen why you need it.
Has this been your experience throughout your career, John, throughout your lifetime, or do you think that's really changed, that inability to have healthy discourse? Okay. Well, could you talk about when you saw that change?
I think, you see, you had a great complacency that set in after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. There was a view around, democracy's won out. No one's ever going to challenge democracy. Well, I was actually acting PM at 9/11. You remember the attacks on the Twin Towers? That told us that there were people who loathed Western democracy and would do anything to try and damage it. That was an attempt to bring down our economies. And, it was a pretty shocking moment. It was pretty risky for a little while. We wondered how much damage the economies would suffer. And we've had to now invest billions, and I don't know how many lives, in trying to break up training grounds for terrorists in places like Afghanistan, what have you. But then came the great financial crisis. And I remember thinking after that, we've spent a heap of money. Governments now need to do something about all that debt and so forth. And no one would. Nobody wanted to face up to it. So governments went looking for inflation, and that's always dangerous. It has made people with assets, like houses, richer than ever in many Western countries, while young people can't get a start because assets are so expensive. And you're sort of seeing this loss of way, and it's tied partly to, or heavily, to culture. We're losing confidence. Let me put it this way. We're losing confidence and trust in one another. We're losing confidence and trust in our institutions, the institutions of freedom, whether it's the church, whether it's education, the police, the courts, the law, the parliaments. Worse than that, we're losing confidence in the underlying beliefs and values that built those institutions of freedom. As people said, we want to maximise people's freedom. Freedom's not licensed, by the way. Freedom is freedom from, which is called negative freedom, freedom from oppression, from fear, from obsession, from reliance or addiction on the one hand, and freedom to you reach your best is positive freedom. To go out there and be the best you can and to make the greatest contribution you can. It's a freedom actually to do the right thing. That freedom can be its own worst enemy when it becomes license. I will do whatever I like. So here's another little pointer. You can track the loss of faith and confidence in, belief in free speech, which is one of the 4 fundamental freedoms we're supposed to have, on American campuses. And about 10 years ago, it switched from majority support for free speech. I mean, you and I might say, who can be against free speech? But it's now there's minority support only on American campuses. And I suspect it's the same here for free speech. People say, no, it should be appropriate speech. Well, who determines what's appropriate speech? You can't make if I'm going to stand up and talk to 100 people, it doesn't matter what I do. If I say anything of substance, there'll be people who are going to be offended, who won't like it. That's the way it is. And I need to perhaps be challenged by their ideas. They need to be challenged by mine. Sometimes that will be harmful. But who's going to decide what's appropriate speech? And you can see the reason it's happened. When social media came along, too many people expressed too much hatred and tried to cancel too many other people. And so too many people got hurt and they started to say, if this is free speech, I'm not for it. You've got to use your freedoms wisely and with respect for one another. Otherwise, they will go.
It's true. And I think that's, as you said before, it leads to disengagement. People just give up. It's hopeless. Like I can't even say anything without being, talked about horribly and whatever. What are your thoughts, John, on the voice referendum, talking about a moment in our culture where we're considering taking a real turn in a new direction? As I understand it, you're part of the No campaign. Correct me if I'm wrong there. But I was interested in your thoughts on that and how that's going to affect Australia. Okay.
Well, I'm worried I'm talking too much, but I want to begin by saying that my family, you mentioned it at the beginning, we've been in the northwest of New South Wales now since the 1820s. And my family have been intertwined with Aboriginal people for many years. Warren Mundines and my family, for example, since the 1830s. I grew up with Aboriginals, went to primary school with Aboriginals. I live in the district where the one and only real hero that we've got properly recorded from Aboriginal times, the Red Chief, the Red Kangaroo, famous local chief, would have lived about the time Cook sailed up the east coast, and carefully passed on his story by oral historians who were very, very highly trained. Remarkable story. And then I represented a lot of Aboriginal people. And I care. Nothing hurts me more, when I think of the things that affect me emotionally than some of the wilder scenes I used to see in some of the schools where Aboriginal kids' lives were just being poured down the drain. Their home environment, their community environment was so dysfunctional that they weren't attending school. And when they did, it was a terrible mess. But I don't think the predictor of what happens to children is based on the colour of skin. I think it's a question of family and community, and no less a figure than Peter Sutton, who's an enormously respected Australian writer in this area, who's lived his life with Aboriginal people and is recognised very highly by Aboriginal people. And he made that very point, dysfunctional environments will produce dysfunctional children. And I see nothing in the voice that will change that because people don't understand this. This is part of the problem we've got. Information overload, people don't engage. There have been 7 voices since the Whitlam era. This will be number 8. None of the 7 have worked. I don't see this one as having... No one's been able to tell me, not least of all the Prime Minister, why this will be different. You've had a plethora of voices. What we actually need is ears, not voices. We know what the problems are, and we know broadly where the solutions are. And there's a heap of Aboriginal advisory bodies, and the Australian taxpayer spends a great deal of money. I mean, really serious money on programs. So we just got to get them right and start listening. That's point 1. I think the model's wrong. Point 2 is the process is terrible. It's an appalling thing to call people, and I'm one of them, who have genuine questions. And I'm on a panel as one other non-Indigenous person, just 2 of us, and 5 Indigenous people who are saying this is a bad idea. Are you going to say someone like Jacinta Price, who has lived experience in Aboriginal communities, unlike many of the elites who are hinting that she's somehow or other got this wrong, that she's a racist?
Mm.
That is not the Australian way to do things. Racism is a form of hatred. It's really important to understand that. Hatred is never acceptable, particularly from a Christian's perspective, yours and mine. Never. It's absolutely wrong. It lies at the heart of the world's problems. I think there's more than a little bit of hatred in some of the people who are bandying around the idea that you're a racist if you oppose this model.
Yeah.
The third thing I would say is at the heart of Western freedom is the idea that every citizen enjoys the same status in our legal arrangements. And the most basic legal document we have is our Constitution. No one should be below it.
Yes.
No one should be above it. We should all enjoy the same status as Australians. Now, that means that we've got some work to do to try and make sure that the Aboriginals, and it's not all Aboriginals by any means, many are doing very, very well. And we should be very proud of that. But those who are not, where we do have troubles, the objective should be to ensure they're fully participating in the Australian family. We should not carve out a special group right. That is the beginning of divisions along racial lines. That's what it is by definition.
Mm.
And I'll be really blunt here and say one of the problems we've got is that not enough people have enough democratic literacy to understand the importance of ensuring that the Constitution remains absolutely committed to the idea of the equality of every single Australian.
Mm-hmm. So essentially your concern is that the voice referendum would create division, and it would change the Constitution in a way that is potentially unchangeable or very difficult to change back, and does actually, ironically, create division between Australians.
Yes, absolutely. And there is absolutely no getting away from the fact that the Prime Minister, who I think probably means well and really does believe in this, but he's saying this is a modest proposal, it'd be rude to reject it, it's the vibe, it won't interrupt the way we're running our lives. Many of the activists behind the voice are saying, it'll be very disruptive. We will have the right to have our issues resolved by the courts, not by the Parliament. Once this thing's changed, this will be the last chance Australians have on any say whether the model works or not. The 7 previous ones, governments have wound up because they haven't worked. This one, you won't be able to. It'll be locked in the Constitution. Only another referendum could get rid of it. So at the very least, the proponents of the voice, as it is at the moment, and to my way of thinking, it will be a legal quagmire. It'll be an absolute mess. It will slow government down. It's already cumbersome enough, and it won't help Aboriginal people. It'll end up rebounding on them. It really will. They'll be blamed for their activists. And this is the problem, of course. Well-meaning Aboriginal people everywhere, Indigenous people will find that the activists... This was the biggest complaint I ever had made to me by Aboriginals. They would say, the wrong people are representing us. You've set up these structures, boss, and the wrong people have now got the power. That used to happen all the time. It's one of the reasons why I've been on the front line of this stuff. And because I really care, I actually think more often than not we get the wrong people speaking for Aboriginal people on the ground. So, I think it will end up in a situation where Aboriginals Indigenous Australians end up wearing the blame for a bogged down political environment that's slower and more cumbersome than ever, and Australians are frustrated enough with it now. None of that is to say that I don't believe that we should recognise Aboriginals.
Yes.
But I think we can do it a better way.
Yes.
I absolutely believe we need to do more to give them economic opportunity out of the vast amounts of land that have been now given back to their trust. And I absolutely believe we need to hear the cries, particularly of those women trying to defend their children in small, remote communities, in particular, where their children are not as safe as they ought to be and not able to get a good education and a good start in life. All those things matter. I just think this is the wrong way to do it. I genuinely, deeply believe it's the wrong way to do it, and that it'll be divisive and that it will over time backfire.
Yeah. Well, really well said, John. And obviously you have an incredible amount of experience in this area and in politics as well. And it's really interesting to hear a bit of the backstory of yourself and the connection with Aboriginals going back to the 1830s.
if anyone wants to read it, because we need to be really realistic. No culture has everything right or wrong. I don't have everything right or wrong. You don't. None of our listeners do. And cultures are the same. But we've got this idea of utopianism about every culture except our own. Ours is evil and everybody else's is terrible. We should be realistic about ours. We should be realistic about others. So read The Red Chief. The Red Chief is a great book to read because it really tells you how they lived, and it's a story of a very noble person backed by noble people trying to help him salvage a tribe that had lost its way and become fat, lazy, indulgent, and corrupt.
Wow.
Also tells you about how they were subject all the time to other tribes wanting to dispossess them of their land. They lived in constant fear of that. They also lived in fear of the witch doctor pointing the bone. So we need to be realistic about these things. They didn't have everything right. We don't have everything right. But a properly functioning democracy is the best way to fix the things that are not right. I believe that very passionately.
Yeah, really well said. Really well said, John. When you look back on your political career, obviously much success, and the Liberal Party was an incredible time, maybe a golden era during that season. How do you look back at your time in politics? How would you summarise it?
I'll tell you one thing I will say. I sometimes pinch myself and say, did a boy from the bush really end up as Deputy Prime Minister? And did I really have the privilege, I'll say it, of serving with two men that I hold very dear and respect hugely, John Haidt and Peter Costello. I mean, that, I suppose, was, you'd say, the leadership group for the 6 years that I was Deputy PM. But many other colleagues as well. And it was a reforming government. We did a lot of things that were not popular at the time, like cutting expenditure back in the late 90s to try and get the budget back in order. We said we were going to stop the intergenerational theft, because when one generation doesn't live within its means, it's asking the next generation, and it's now so bad, probably the generation after that, the unborn, to pay for its inability and refusal to live within its means. And we'd set out to tackle that problem and to tackle a whole lot of other problems. And it was hard. It wasn't easy. The grind at the time and the impact on family and those sorts of things. But there's a camaraderie there. And, I've come away with an enormous respect for some of the people that I worked with, not just politicians, of course, but the people who supported me in my electorate, some in the media who I felt were so fair and so honest and helped us advance the debate, even though I'm very cynical about a lot of the media now because they just don't know their oats and they're not professional anymore. There are exceptions, but exceptions would be the word. And I really despair. I went to a church, I'm digressing now, a few years ago, and I met a delightful young Australian lady who was studying at a media school, and she said to me, we're just taught that politicians are always lying. They're always liars and they're always lying, and our job is to show people where they're lying. I said, what if they're actually good, honest people who are, answering with the greatest... Oh, no, we never taught that. Well, come on. How's the system going to work if we're going to teach our journalists to be as cynical as that? She was seeing through it, but she was saying that's what she was being taught at one of the most prominent media schools in this country.
Yeah, wow.
And it would have been a bunch of ideologically driven lecturers and tutors. We all know how it works. Well, thanks, fellas. You're doing a really good job of building cynicism. Now, that's a terrific thing to have in our community. Rife cynicism. So no one believes in anything. No one trusts anyone.
So you were known, John, during your political time, you were known as a man of integrity. I think John Howard made a famous statement about you being an incredible man of integrity. How did you hold that together during that, difficult position that you're in as a politician? You're talking about media, all the different opinions. How did you do that? Is it tied to your faith? Is it your upbringing? Just interested.
Well, I've said to John Howard a couple of times, it was incredibly kind of you to say that. I feel unworthy, and I'm always worried that I can't live up to it. But look, I'd have to say my own father was not a Christian believer. In fact, he was quite saddened by my belief. He was skeptical and saddened by it. But he was a man of unbelievable integrity. He had a terrible World War II. It had made him very realistic about the human condition, I suppose. But he was deeply committed to honesty, even down to the crossing of the T's and the dotting of the I's. And if I wanted to get into trouble with my father, really get into trouble, I'd say something that was perhaps not the whole truth or wasn't the truth at all, or bang, I really copped it. As I became a believer in my teenage years, I started to understand that integrity in the way you deal with others is really important. The opposite of integrity, actually, Isaiah tells us this, woe is me, Lord, when he sees God. I am undone. That is the opposite of integrity. So integrity means being together. I don't claim any great stakes in that regard. It's nice that other people have been kind enough to say that of me. I just try to do my best, and I'm very conscious from this side of me that I'm not sure God would say the same thing, dependent on his forgiveness. The kind of thing that John, the one that I appreciated more, was that in his book he had a picture of the two of us. And he said, my longest serving Deputy Prime Minister, we trusted each other completely. And that really meant a lot to me. I trusted him. It means an incredible amount that he trusted me. We don't stop and think about trust enough, you see. Whenever two or more are gathered together, trust becomes an issue. If you're suddenly with a couple of other people, you don't know them very well, you're starting straight from scratch. Do I trust these people? If I can work with them. We can, our efforts will be cooperative and we can advance together. If I don't, well, I'm looking for security and this isn't going to work. So when trust breaks down, and it's breaking down very badly, it's all research. Look at the Australian National University's work on the trust in Australian governments. It's come down, down, down for 50 years. There's a point when it'll all break. We've got to rebuild trust if we're to survive as a free and open and progressive society going somewhere.
Well, you're right, John. It's incredible that we had a Prime Minister and the Deputy yourself that had that level of trust and friendship and professionalism in your job and leading our nation. I don't know if we'll ever see something like that again because of the state of trust and where it is in our culture. And I know from reading John Howard's biographies and things like that he is also a man of faith. Is that something that you talked about together?
Not a lot. We kind of just assumed that it meant that we had a broadly similar worldview, I think would be the way to say it.
Yeah.
He was committed to a deeper Australia. He believed in the service model of leadership. Now, here's an interesting one. See, we instill in our children the idea that they're the centre of their universe, it's all about them. And then we wonder why, when they're on a political stage, they look as though they're interested in looking after themselves. That's our culture's value. That's what we've taught our young people. And then when we see it up there, we say, no, we don't like that. It's not meant to be about them. It's meant to be about us. And so I don't know how they work these things out, but 4 billion people apparently tapped in to see the funeral arrangements in Britain for Queen Elizabeth II, who I think was the most extraordinary global leader. I really do, figurehead.
Yeah.
And why? Well, she was respected because she was a servant leader. She put others and the interests of her people ahead of her own. And people over years, they come to recognise that. And so we love the idea of servant leadership, and so we ought to. But we ought to instill that in our children rather than the idea, hey, listen, Buster, it's all about you, mate. You're the centre of your universe. Not just your universe, the universe. It's all about you. And that's led to this great cultural problem we've got of sort of radical individualism and the idea that the greatest virtue of all is autonomy. I feel, therefore I am, and no one dare offend me by saying I'm not who I am because my feelings about who I am conflict with reality. And I think that is frankly destroying a lot of young people. This idea of finding yourself within, and I will be who I feel I am, even if clear, hard-headed thinking tells me not everything I feel about myself is right.
Yeah, that's very it's very different from what we believe as Christians. You know, it's the
Yeah.
opposite, isn't it? Christ, as we just celebrated Easter, and part of that celebration is that Christ gave his life and became the last and the least, and even to the point of death and suffering on a cross, and that ultimately is servant leadership, to give your life for others, whether they like you or not. And that's an incredible model that I don't think any of us will really live up to. But Christ was the perfect model that we aspire to. And but I mean, our culture, it makes sense in a way, doesn't it? If we don't believe in the gospel anymore, if we've really and unhinged from our Christian roots, then we're not going to end up in that place of true servant leadership and sacrifice. And obviously, as a believer, as a pastor myself, it saddens me, but it also, I suppose, excites me, the challenge ahead to bring the gospel to a new generation, because every generation of young people, every generation of Australians has to find God for themselves. And I believe with all my heart that that's possible, that people can find Him, and that He is in the business of renewing and restoring and bringing people, families, societies, communities back to Him. But it's a great challenge that we have on our hands, isn't it?
That is my lived experience. Let me put that on the table. Regeneration through faith.
Mm.
And I'm deeply thankful for that. And I realise that's countercultural. But then I, with great respect, have to say, yeah, I am countercultural. I don't like where we're going. And look, I do think, as you say, it brings me back to the thing we were talking about a moment ago. At the heart of the influence of Christianity on Western culture, we've been appalling at it. It's been one step forward and two back and then three forward. But the arc, until quite recent times, was to be greatly influenced by the idea of the God of the universe humbling himself unto a grisly death, though innocent, at the hands of the braying crowd. Servant leadership, humility, it being about others, love your neighbour as yourself. These were sort of great Western, not always respected, or in the sense of people didn't always live by them, but it was the creed that was accepted and the ideal that was held up, and it's now rejected. And here is my challenge, the one that I politely say to people all the time. Well, you say that was a bad model. What on earth do you think the one we've got now is?
Yeah.
How's it going for us? It's not working.
Mm.
It's not. We know that. All the data tells you. I've quoted some of the problems that young people face, but we've got a pandemic of loneliness, for example.
Mm.
That's the
Mm.
result of people saying family doesn't matter anymore, kids don't matter anymore. We're not far off the point where it'll be very common for people not to have siblings and not to have cousins and not to have aunts and uncles
Mm.
because the birth rate's plummeting, families are disregarded, and when they do happen, they break up. And for most of us, our lived experience has been, and sadly for some, and many of them have felt a very deep sadness about it. It hasn't been the case, but for most of us, many of our most important relationships, our sense of being, of help and nurture in tough times, has been family grouping
Mm.
around us.
Definitely.
Are we really so wise to have denigrated the family, to have made it meaningless and let it swing in the breeze like a carcass?
Mm.
Look at the impact it's having on our future, which is our children.
Yeah. And you mentioned before your own childhood, John, and growing up, and you found Christ in your teenage years. What can you tell us that story? Your father or your family didn't have a Christian background, but you found faith.
Yeah, well, I had a terrible tragedy when I was a teenager. I'm one of those people who's experienced accidentally being responsible for another person's death, and it was my sister in a
Hmm.
backyard game of cricket.
Wow.
Um, I was hitting my father for six all over the place, and my sister was sitting a very long way away, and she looked up. She was just being there with her father and her brother during the Easter holidays when we were teenagers. and saw a ball coming for her, instinctively turned away, but it caught her in the back of the neck. I mean, it was a long, long, long way away. You sort of, you look out there on the horizon, you think, how could a ball, I mean, it's sort of like a rifle shot. It's really just a terrible thing. But that presented me, and my childhood ended instantly. I needed to find big answers to big questions. So I'd gone to a place that very, very few people do, where frivolity and so forth. And you either are just dead, and you either sort of let it destroy you, or you say, I have to have hope. And for me, it was, well, why suffering? That's the first big question.
Yes.
And the second big question is, anybody understands, anybody cares, anybody done anything about it? And the third is, will the wounds and the hurt and the pain ever end? And will I ever know joy again? And that's sort of three-sided triangle. And I tell that story somewhat reluctantly. It's a very deeply personal and painful one. But, in some ways, I do so because I watched Jordan Peterson talk to an audience in Sydney of 1,000 people, packed hall, many of them young men, and I realised that they wanted steak, not thin gruel, if that makes sense. They reckon life's tough. They want real stories from real people who have lived the really tough side of life and not been able to say, look, it's all sugar and gloss and all things nice. It's not. Life's tough. Now, I had a particularly tough experience. I still don't have all the answers. But that three-sided triangle, well, yes, suffering because it's a broken world, because of, we chose to try and do it our way. It doesn't explain why that particular suffering, but it's much better to believe that it's not meant to be this way. It was not the intended order, than to believe that it's all just chaos and random, like Richard Dawkins says it is. Secondly, does anybody understand? Well, yes, Christ does. He knew more pain, physical and emotional, more rejection, more injustice than any of us have. So, yeah, he knows. I can't say, hey, you're being too tough, you're being unfair. You try it. Well, he has tried it. And he took death to the grave when he died with it because he rose again. It wasn't able to hold him. That's the Christian story. We can be freed because as it couldn't hold him, if we believe in him, we're not held either.
Oh, it's amazing. I really appreciate you sharing that. That's a really personal story and event. How old were you when that tragedy occurred?
14, 15.
No, wow.
And I've, since, it does happen. It does happen. I've had the sad privilege of talking through my experiences with young people who have inadvertently done something innocently, and had the shocking experience of it turning out terribly for someone else. This is a tough world, I mean, you sometimes you have to ask the big questions. And to go back to one of the things we were saying earlier, we've tried to tell our young people, and they call it snow plowing, don't they, or helicopter parenting, where we try to, take all the pain, all the toughness out of life. Well, that's not real life.
Catches up with you eventually. I actually got hit in the head with a cricket ball when I was 15 and spent a week in hospital, lost all hearing in my left ear. So I was only that far away from losing my life myself. So I nearly had bleeding on the brain, and very close. Got hit in the same spot that the Australian cricketer did, who died instantly. Same mastoid bones. So yeah, that's really full on. I think you're so right though, John, about pain and suffering, and it's always the first question that people who don't believe in Jesus or believe in the Christian worldview have, isn't it? Why are children dying of cancer? If God is God, why doesn't he remove suffering? And it's the big question. It's a big criticism of Christianity. And I think you've just, brilliantly explained that with your triangle example there. Just an Easter, a game we've just celebrated, brilliantly explains that God didn't, God actually came down and became a human and suffered like we suffer and lived like we live in order to overcome even the worst tragedy and difficult experience like you've been through. So from there,
I could not live with the idea that it was meaningless. That I could not live with that idea, and I couldn't live with the idea that God won't remove that. the suffering, because the promise is that he will. But there's a price we have to
Yeah.
believe.
Yeah.
That's the promise.
Yes. That gives us hope. The resurrection gives us hope. If there wasn't that, then it's all pretty
If it's all
meaningless,
just
isn't
an
it?
accident, then why do I feel all the pain?
Yeah. It's true. Thank goodness for Christ's death and resurrection. Hey, when did you, from there? Where did your faith kind of go after that? Obviously, it would have taken some time to develop and establish.
Yeah, look, I drifted away a bit for a while, I'm ashamed to say. The end of school and those days out in the country, there were cars to be had and events to go to and university to experience. But in my final year at university, I was studying a course called Late Modern European History. And really it was the thought, the sort of the great clashes of ideas from the Reformation on.
Mm-hmm.
And as I saw it in the end, you had, if you like, the sort of Christian worldview being deeply challenged by fascism and communism, both of which were deeply atheistic and antagonistic to Christianity. And I thought to myself, well, that's a bit of a fork in the road for me. And I re-embraced intellectually the things that I'd come to believe, I suppose, emotionally about faith when I was a schoolboy. And I found that quite a hard process. I mean, as my father said, you'll lose all your friends. I probably did. I don't know. Not that I've, particularly since, my married life, I've not known loneliness, and I feel deeply for people who do. I think loneliness must be a terrible, terrible blight.
Yeah, definitely.
We
Yeah,
know that a horrible number of Australians are now lonely, and I find that a deep source of sadness.
yeah, it's one of the biggest problems in Australia, the leading issues, isn't it? I think it's something so special that the church can provide, community, meaning, hope. Something we try to do in my humble little church, and something that God can provide ultimately, can't He? Is a connection, a relationship, a Father in heaven. But yeah, it is a huge problem, and I think hopefully churches can position themselves. People of faith can share the gospel in a way that people can come to know community and come to know God, who is a community Himself, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So it's amazing to hear your story, John, how your faith has been shaped, how you grew up with it. What was it like in politics being a Christian? But do you think it was different in the season you were in, maybe to the season a
Yeah.
politician might be now?
Yeah, you could see the trajectory emerging, but there was nowhere near the sort of personal invective. There was a much deeper sense of camaraderie. People socialised together more, and I think that was a good thing. I'm not sure the new Parliament House helps that very much, by the way. I think it's a rather austere, remote sort of building where you're not cheek by jowl with people when you're arguing in the chamber or, mixing in the King's Hall afterwards or whatever. The other smaller one threw you together more. Maybe that was a better thing as well. But society has fragmented a lot since then. Identity politics, the return to tribalism, polarisation, and it shows up in a democracy. Well, it should. The people you elect are always going to reflect you as a community.
It's true.
And it's changed hugely. One of the biggest changes, of course, is that so many people of wealth and influence now who would once have voted for the Conservative side of politics or the coalition now vote Labor or Green. And many people who once would have voted Labor now support what they see as the more mainstream way of thinking on the coalition side of things. And that's reflected in America. Red and blue have swapped, as they say over there. And it's reflected in Great Britain as well. I must say that in some ways I find it passing strange. I would have thought that people in well-to-do electorates who make incredibly careful decisions about economics in particular, we know that. That's why they live in those suburbs. They've done very well. They'd be thinking about their investments, about the schools they send their kids to and what have you. And yet they've been prepared to vote people who, really are quite narrow in their interests. So they'll talk about the environment or they'll talk about corruption, but they don't talk about tax, productivity, defence, trade, education, the big things that are actually going to shape our country very substantially, in which the major parties have to have a position on right across the board. This sort of strange narrowing and willingness just to look at one or two things. I must say, I think I'll say this, I'm not here to be party political, but I do wish more Australians would read the Greens' defence policy at this grave time when we've seen what's happened in the Ukraine and we're worried about what might happen in China. The Greens' policy is to defund basically our defence force and to build a special peace negotiating forum to resolve conflict by discussion, which sounds nice, but can you imagine the Australian Greens rocking up to Mr. Putin and saying, "Oh, listen, old chap, you've got it all wrong. We can show you another way." And Mr. Putin saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I got it all wrong. I'll after hundreds of thousands of casualties and all immense damage, I'll pull my people out of the Ukraine." In other words, we need to be realistic and use this as much as we use this in our attitude towards public policy.
Well, what about the Liberal Party, John? What are your thoughts on that at the moment? Obviously, it's having some struggles and it's not in power around the nation. Where do you think that's all at?
Well, that's a story to be untold. I mean, it's not fatal. Goodness me, these things have happened often. People fall from grace incredibly quickly politically these days, probably too quickly. And the challenges Australia faces are absolutely enormous. And unless the current government handles them with extraordinary clarity of thought, of focus, and with courage, I'm afraid those challenges, economic and otherwise, will be very damaging for the country, and Australians may well be looking for something quite quickly. Now, that's not what I'm wishing on the Australian people. I'm just saying that we live in highly volatile times. And if the government gets it wrong, the Australian people will move very, very quickly. There's nothing guaranteed or ironclad. These people who say that the Liberal Party's in permanent decline, what have you, it's not like that. They've got to pick their game up. They've got to learn the lessons. They've got to recognise that people want them to actually believe in something, a better Australia. They've got to be able to articulate it. And they've got to be able to inspire people to work towards it.
Yeah,
that can happen. It needs to happen. It should happen. You want both sides of politics to be, if you like, clear in what they stand for and arguing their case and seeking to convince the Australian people. And you need the Australian people to be engaged and paying attention, which is my point about, I've got to say it, my concern that some of the best educated, most privileged areas in Australia are only focusing on very narrow, almost single issue sort of stuff, when in fact the issues the country faces are enormous and we need to pull together, not fragment, which is what we're doing.
It's true.
Fragmenting.
It's true. As we begin to finish up, John, my last question for you is you've been a leader for a long time, been involved in leadership and top level, high level leadership. If you could put it down to one thing, what would be your greatest leadership lesson? If you're talking to a aspiring leader, talking to the next generation, what would be your greatest lesson you've learned as a leader?
I don't know that I got to put it down to one thing. I think it's a multiplicity of factors. I'll leave you with this thought. Henry Ford II gave the neatest. Some of your listeners have probably heard me say this. I've been saying it for 40 years, and I think the book is still up there behind me. I got it out of book on Henry Ford. That a leader will have a vision. They'll know where they want to go and what needs to be done. They'll be able to articulate it clearly to others so they understand what the vision is and why it's important. And then they'll have about themselves the personal qualities that make others want to work with them to achieve that vision. So that's broadly what leadership is. Now, it can be for ill or it can be for good. Adolf Hitler had a vision. He was able to explain it. And unfortunately, he was able to get people to work with him to try and make it a reality. So that's where the servant model comes in. You want servant model leadership, dedicated to others, humble, and to use, a word that's often misunderstood now, loving and compassionate. But somebody who, having formed a vision of what needs to be done, can then explain it clearly so that people have confidence in it and they say, yes, that person is a person of integrity. They're put together. I believe them. and I'll go with them. I think people are crying out for that. But let me just say, it's not just the occupant of the lodge. People with those qualities are needed everywhere, heading up the smallest community in the family. They're needed. You know, in the local community, in the sporting clubs, in local government, in state government, in service clubs, everywhere you look. We've got to shake ourselves out of the complacency and re-engage. We need leadership at all levels again. We need it fast.
Brilliant.
Not to say there aren't many good leaders out there. There are, but we need a lot more of them.
Yeah, that's true. I love that, John. It's a really great leadership tip, and it's a great definition of leadership, a great picture of it. So I really appreciate
there's Henry Ford's.
Yeah. But I really appreciate your time tonight, John. I really enjoyed talking with you, and it's been a real honour actually to meet you and spend some time with you and just hear from a great Australian, a great leader. A lot about your life. Appreciate your vulnerability. I appreciate your insights, and appreciate everything about you. So thank you very much.
Well, you've been too kind, and I hope it's just some encouragement to someone somewhere.
I trust you were impacted by that Leadership Lessons podcast. I would love to hear your thoughts about today's podcast. Please comment down below, and please review the podcast and share it with a friend. Doing this inspires us and helps others to find the podcast. See you next time.